Managing standard switches with the vSphere client is a relatively easy thing to do. Now, don't forget that standard switches are a function of an ESXi host itself, and it's on the hosts where they need to be managed. So in the vSphere client, simply find an ESXi host for yourself, click on that host and go to the Configure tab, and under Networking, you'll see virtual switches, VM kernel ports, physical adapters, and some of the TCP/IP configuration relative to IPv6 there. If you click on virtual switches, you'll see the standard or default set of networking. You've got, notice, a VM kernel port here, as well as a virtual machine port group. We can see the VM kernel port is got an IP address. We call it a VMK. This is VMK0, which is the default. And you can see here that there are 4 virtual machines attached to the virtual machine port group called VM network. Now, if we want to add networking, if we want to add a VM kernel port, if we want to add a virtual machine port group, if we want to add a new virtual switch, the Add Networking button brings up a wizard that allows you to do this. And it's a 5-step process where we start by looking at the connection type, looking at creating a VM kernel port, creating a virtual machine port group, or creating or managing a new physical adapter. Once you've decided to go through that process and say, for example, we add a new virtual machine, a new VM kernel port, like we've done here. Here we've created a VM kernel port for IP storage, and you can see that it's VMK1 on 172.20.10.61. And you can select things like the network settings, whether or not you want to get your IP address from DHCP or put it in manually, set the subnet mask, and so on. You will also see on the other side the uplinks. So if you can imagine, this is your virtual switch here. You've got your port groups and VM kernel ports here on one side, and you've got your physical adapters that they're bound to on the other side. In this case, these 2 VM kernel ports and single virtual machine port group are bound to VMNIC0 and VMNIC1. VMNIC0 and VMNIC1 represent the first 2 physical ports on your particular ESXi host. If you select physical adapters, you can see all of those VMNICs and the speed that they are connected at, the configured speed. You can see whether or not any of these physical NICs are active on or actively tied to a virtual switch or not, and you can see their MAC address. You can adjust, if you want, by selecting one of the physical NICs and hitting the edit button, the speed and duplex settings for yourselves. So that's a relatively easy thing to do. Now, when it comes to the distributed switch, remember the distributed switch is available with Enterprise Plus networking, or if you have vSAN in your environment. The distributed switch is a different sort of idea. Rather than managing the networking at the level of the ESXi host itself, everything is configured at a single location, that being vCenter, and then passed down to the ESXi hosts as you make your configuration changes. So the vCenter portion of this then becomes a control plane where all of the management and configuration is done. Okay? At the data plane down here, that's the ESXi hosts. Now you'll notice that on the distributed switch, once again managed at vCenter, we have some virtual machine port groups and some VM kernel ports, right? And here's another virtual machine port group, and we have a group of uplinks. Now this group of uplinks refers to physical uplinks on each of the ESXi hosts that have then joined that distributed switch. When changes are made here, those changes are passed down to the ESXi hosts where hidden virtual switches are created, and that's where all of the actual movement of the data happens. Now you can see that there are some features that are common between the standard switch and the distributed switch. They're both based on layer 2, they both support VLANs, they both support IPv6, NIC teaming, things like that. We can do things like outbound traffic shaping, also on the standard switch. Now, in the next lesson, we're going to talk about traffic shaping and some of the other policies that we can set up on our standard or distributed switches. We also, on the standard switch, support Cisco Discovery Protocol, where Cisco switches in particular can tell ESXi a little bit about their configuration so that we, from the perspective of ESXi, can ensure that we're plugged into the right ports on our physical switches and that those ports are configured properly. Now, there are certainly a whole slew of features that are exclusive just to that distributed switch. And you can see a list of some of these here, including things like inbound traffic shaping, right? Where on the standard switch, we had outbound traffic shaping. On the distributed switch, we add to that inbound traffic shaping. We can do things like private VLANs and load-based NIC teaming. We're going to discuss NIC teaming on the standard switch in just a little bit as a part of the next lesson as well. So there's a whole series of features that are available to the distributed switch that hopefully allow a distributed switch to then play in much of the technologies that have become standard across our physical devices. So that does it for the introduction to networking in vSphere. Once again, in the next lesson, we'll look at some of the policies that we can set around things like traffic shaping and NIC teaming and so on. So stay tuned for that. But before you hit that, we're going to go ahead and do lab number 11, where we'll have an opportunity to play with some of the standard switch configuration. So we're going to view the configuration in our vSphere client by clicking on our host and going to the configuration tab. We're going to create a new standard switch, and we're going to place a virtual machine port group on that. And then we're going to take our virtual machines and edit the settings of those virtual machines to move them from one virtual machine network or one virtual machine port group to another virtual machine port group. So enjoy the lab, and when we come back, we'll have a look at lesson 2 in this. Okay, so I hope that's been a good overview for you of the basics of the networking on a standard switch in ESXi. We looked at the different types of switch connections, that being virtual machine port groups that provide networking to virtual machines, and VM kernel ports, which provide networking to ESXi itself. We know how in the vSphere client to view that configuration of our standard switches, and we have an idea as to whether or not we want to step up a little bit into a distributed switch architecture to simplify the management, as well as to add lots and lots of features to our virtual networking to allow it to play in some of those sorts of settings where some of our more modern physical architecture has already been in place. Okay, so have a look at lab number 8, and we'll see you back in lesson number 2. Talk to you soon.